Hi, Karen. Yeah, so I'm just doing my chapter two review thing quick. Sorry it took so long. I finally got my hands on the book. Um, yeah, me and Sid are sharing for the rest of the semester, hopefully. So hopefully we can trade off and get a bit better at doing these on time. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, going through the chapter, I thought it was interesting. So my last post I did was in the paper that I wrote. I kind of talked about how like growing up for myself, reading really wasn't given a second thought outside of English class once you hit high school. Or at least even once you hit middle school, you don't really read outside of other classes besides English. And it's interesting though, because like for me, reading is like reading, if that makes sense. Like I get the book, I look at the words, and try to figure out what they mean. But it's interesting, like this, they talk about like the text complexity and like the different things that go into like determining text complexity and how you can figure that out and what's best for each grade level. Because I know for myself, like I never really started reading like that. I'm not English major at all. My fiance is, but I'm definitely not. And just kind of understanding like the text quantity or quantitative and qualitative text is really interesting. Sometimes I wonder though if it's almost like like not too informative, like too analytical. It's like I don't know. Like we talked about in class a little bit about how a reading might seem complicated according to like the models that you can use to like determine the complexity of a text, but like a word like manufacturer has a lot of syllables, but it's really not that hard for students to understand because they're used to the word. But I wonder sometimes it's a little too analytical because I know like myself like in the world of like political science, like that's that my emphasis for education is political science, and there's a lot of words in there that are just kind of weird. That like if say like a science major saw them or an English major may have saw it, may see them, may not know what they mean. And I feel like a big part of like reading and like learning how to read is like being interested in what you're reading. I kind of talked about that in the first chapter. As far as like text complexity goes, I feel like if you have somebody that's like a student that's really engaged in like what they're learning, like a student taking an AP class, like an AP history class, for example, like for them, I'm guessing like 70% of the students actually like history and are there because they like history. So I feel like for those students, you can really kind of push them to learn more about history and push them with the text. Or even like, I don't know, because I plan to be like a middle school and high school teacher. I feel like even if you give them like more complex reading, like say, I don't know, like you give them like the Constitution to read, and the Constitution's a really difficult document to read. I mean, I just read it for one of my classes, and even being a junior in college, I had trouble reading it just because of some of the old language and some of it's just it's written by a bunch of really smart people. So I think, but going with that, like I feel like as a teacher, like you can kind of help walk them through these certain things. So for myself, like being a social studies teacher, one of the things I really want to implement in my classroom is like they call them like primary sources, so like first-hand sources, like from written from the Times, like Constitution's a primary source, like handwritten letters are primary sources. I would like to like incorporate that more in my like curriculum, like get students engaged, get students reading, maybe a little more interested. But one of the things I'd like fear is like it'd be a little too complex for students to read. And just based on this like text complexity stuff, I feel like most of the stuff will be, especially since most like the historical stuff is pretty old. And like I don't really know how that's judged because like I know they talked about Shakespeare in here too briefly, and like Shakespeare's hard to read, not because well, probably because he's a really good writer and he knew what he was doing writing, but also because like it's just such old language that we're just not accustomed to anymore. So I'm kind of curious. Like I guess like one of the things I'm curious about is like you know how much does like this text complexity stuff like really like just like analytical and like I think of like the student like what the teacher can teach, and also just like I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of variables when it comes to like text complexity. The word might be really simple, but like it might not have a lot of syllables or something, but it might be in a really weird language or like old type of English that we're just not accustomed to. So it's like how would you balance that out? How would you teach students old English, old language? Kind of help them through that because I think it's important to read like the word for how it's written, especially like in the Constitution. But like it's just words that I don't know. Like do you just help them through that? Then do you try to like translate that for them, or like you kind of slowly help them figure it out on their own? I don't know. That'd be nice to know. But yeah, all right. Thanks, Karen.